The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Nora Vásquez knew what was inside it. She had known since the moment it arrived, had recognized the letterhead through the thin paper, the way you recognize the silhouette of something you have been dreading for a long time. She had moved it twice, once to make room for her daughter's backpack, once to wipe down the counter beneath it. But she had not opened it, because opening it would make it real, and she was not ready for it to be real yet. The apartment was quiet in the way that small places become quiet after children fall asleep. Her daughter Mia, 9 years old, and still too trusting of the world to understand how close the edges of it pressed, was in the back room, her breath slow and even behind the thin wall. Nora sat at the kitchen table in the last hour before midnight, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The overhead light buzzed faintly. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor's television played something she could not quite make out, a canned laugh track rising and falling at regular intervals like the breathing of something hollow. She was 38 years old, and she was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. Not the tiredness of a single hard day, but the deep bone weariness of years lived at the edge of what was possible. She worked 2 jobs, a full shift at a hospital laundry facility, and a few evenings a week cleaning offices in a building downtown where no one learned her name, where she moved through fluorescent hallways like a ghost, emptying bins and wiping glass, invisible and necessary in equal measure. Between those 2 jobs, she raised Mia alone, packed lunches, signed permission slips, attended school events when she could, and apologized when she couldn't. She managed it all through a combination of discipline and the quiet stubbornness of a woman who had learned early that no one was coming to rescue her. The father had been gone since Mia was 2, not dead, just absent in the way some men become absent, slowly at first and then completely. There were no dramatic fights, no clean breaks, just a gradual erosion, like the way a coastline disappears when you aren't watching, and one morning you look up, and the shore is somewhere you no longer recognize. He sent money sometimes, irregular and insufficient, the kind of financial support that arrived just often enough to prevent legal consequences, and not often enough to actually matter. Nora had stopped counting on it years ago. She had stopped counting on most things. The eviction notice was the 3rd one in 2 years. The landlord had been patient, longer than most would have been, but patience has a limit, and hers had apparently reached it. 90 days. The number sat in her chest like a stone. She had 90 days to find money she did not have, or to find somewhere else to go, which she also did not have. Her credit was damaged from the years when things had been worse, when Mia was sick and the medical bills had stacked up like a physical weight, when she had borrowed from cards to pay other cards until the whole structure collapsed. She was still digging out from under it. There were nights when she sat at this table and added the numbers over and over, as if repetition might change them, as if the sum might somehow be different this time, some hidden column she had missed, some calculation that would show her a way forward she had not yet seen. It never did. The numbers were always the same. There was never enough. There had never been enough. She reached out and pulled the envelope toward her, tore it open with the same precise movement she used for everything she dreaded, quick and final, because hesitation only made it worse. The words confirmed what she already knew. She set the paper down and pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed. Then she picked up her phone and called the only person she ever called when things reached their lowest point. Her grandmother did not answer. The phone rang twice and went to voicemail. And in the pause before the recorded message began, Nora felt something shift in her chest. She had forgotten for a moment that her grandmother was gone. Elena Vásquez had died 11 days ago. She had been 84 years old and sharp until the very end, A woman who had survived things Nora could only partially understand, who had carried a life across borders and through loss, and still managed to make her kitchen smell like something warm every time you walked in. She had been Nora's anchor for as long as Nora could remember. The one voice that made the world seem manageable, the one place that had always felt like safety. And now she was gone, and the family had 3 weeks to clear the house before the lease expired, and the eviction notice lay open on Nora's kitchen table, like a reminder that the world had no interest in grief. The house in Millfield was a modest bungalow on a street where the trees were old enough to have outlived most of the people who had planted them. Elena had lived there for 31 years, long enough that the house had absorbed her, had taken on the particular quality of spaces that are loved and inhabited for decades. A warmth in the walls, a specific smell of cedar and dried herbs, and the faint sweetness of the candles she burned near the window in the evenings. My walking in after her death felt like walking through the past tense of a person. The family arrived on a Saturday morning. Nora's Uncle Hector came with his wife Carmen, both of them wearing the efficient energy of people who had come to solve a problem rather than to mourn. Her cousin Roberto drove up from 3 hours away, parking his new SUV in front of the house, with the comfortable confidence of a man who had done well for himself and wanted people to know it. Aunt Roberto was 33 and worked in commercial real estate, and had been to Europe twice and made sure you knew these things within the first 10 minutes of seeing him. His sister Daniela came separately, later with her husband, and their children ran through the house immediately in the way that children do, indifferent to the weight of the occasion. Nora came with Mia, who held her hand in the driveway and looked at the house with the solemn face of a child, trying to understand something too large for her yet. They had said their goodbyes at the funeral already, but returning to the house was a different kind of goodbye, a more final one. Inside, the family moved in the rhythmic, slightly uncomfortable way of people performing a practical task, weighted with emotion. Hector had brought boxes. Carmen had a notepad. There was conversation about what should go to charity, what should be sold, what might be worth something to an antique dealer. Roberto mentioned twice that his friend knew someone who bought estate contents in bulk, could get them a fair price for the whole lot. Nora said nothing. She moved through the room slowly, touching things as she passed them. A lamp her grandmother had bought at a church sale, the wooden cross above the bed, and the photographs on the hall table arranged in the particular order that Elena had maintained for as long as any of them could remember. It was in the dining room that Nora stopped. The hutch had always been there. It stood against the far wall between the window and the doorway to the kitchen, massive and dark and deeply present, the way old things are present, with the gravity of objects that have witnessed so much they have absorbed some of it. It was made of walnut, or something like it, and a deep brown wood gone nearly black in the grain lines, the finish worn in the places hands had touched it most, along the top edge where Elena had always rested her hand when she stood beside it, along the door handles, which were brass and had been polished so often they had lost most of their surface detail. The upper section was a cabinet with glass-fronted doors, deep behind which Elena kept her good dishes and the small collection of figurines she had brought with her when she came to this country. The lower section was a credenza, deep-drawered and solid, the kind of furniture built with the assumption that it would outlast everyone who ever owned it. Nora stood in front of it for a long time without saying anything. She had grown up with this piece of furniture. She remembered being small enough to fit inside the lower cabinet. She had hidden there during games of hide-and-seek, had sat beside it on holidays while her grandmother arranged the table. She remembered the sound it made when the glass doors were opened, a faint creak on the left hinge that had been the same her entire life. She remembered her grandmother's hands touching it, in the way she touched it, the particular habitual gesture of someone who has a long relationship with an object. She did not remember ever hearing her grandmother say it was valuable, when she did not remember Elena speaking about it in terms of money or history or provenance. But she remembered something else. A sentence, spoken once, quietly, in the kitchen, when Nora was perhaps 12 years old and had asked why Grandma never got rid of the old dark cabinet. Because some things carry more than they show. That was what she had said. And then she had smiled in the way she smiled when she was keeping something, and changed the subject. Nora crossed the room and laid her hand on the top edge of the hutch, in the same place where Elena had always rested hers. The wood was warm from the morning light that came through the window. Beneath her palm, she could feel the grain, uneven and alive, the way wood stays alive long after the tree is gone. "We're selling that." She turned. Roberto had come into the room. He was looking at the hutch with the efficient appraisal of a man calculating market value. "I want it," Nora said. He glanced at her. "It's big and old, and it's going to cost you money to move it. Tony has a buyer interested in taking pieces like this. You won't get market value, but you'll get something. I don't want to sell it." "It's not really your decision alone," Hector said from the doorway. He had appeared without her noticing, holding a cardboard box against his chest. "We all get a say." "Then I'm saying I want it. I want to keep it." Carmen came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at the hutch, and then at Nora, with the particular expression of someone assigning categories: practical, sentimental, reasonable, unreasonable. Nora had been placed in the sentimental column before she had finished speaking. "Where would you even put it?" Carmen asked, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Your place isn't big enough for a piece that size. I'll make it fit." Roberto exhaled through his nose. "Nora, look at it practically. You're struggling. You've said it yourself. We could get a few hundred for this. Maybe more if Tony knows the right person. Split among the family, that's something for everyone. Why would you hold on to a piece of furniture?" "Because it was hers." There was a silence in the room that had a particular texture, the silence of people trying not to say what they were thinking. Nora recognized it. She had lived inside it many times. It was the silence of a family watching one of its members make a decision they could not understand, a decision that appeared to prioritize feeling over sense. They were not cruel people, mostly. They simply operated in the practical register, made decisions the way people make decisions when money is always close to the center of things. They saw the hutch, and they saw currency. Nora saw it and saw her grandmother's hands, saw decades, and saw the sentence she had been carrying for 26 years. Some things carry more than they show. "You can't afford sentiment right now," Roberto said, and the word sentiment in his mouth sounded like a polite synonym for foolishness. "Let her have it if she wants it," Daniela said from the hallway. Her voice was mild, slightly tired. She had been through enough family arguments to know which ones were worth entering. This was not one of those. "It's just a cabinet, so let her have it." There was a brief negotiation. Not a real one, but the family performance of fairness, a few exchanges about what else Nora might waive or accept in exchange for taking the hutch without complaint. In the end, it was agreed that she would forgo the small amount of cash her grandmother had left in the savings account, which Roberto had already been mentally dividing. In exchange, the hutch was hers. No one thought she had gotten the better end of the arrangement. Several of them said so. She smiled and said nothing, and went to find a moving company. The hutch arrived at her apartment on a Tuesday. It took 2 men and most of an afternoon. They had to remove the glass doors temporarily to get it through the doorway, and even then it was close. The dining area in Nora's apartment was not really a dining area, more a suggestion of one. The space between the kitchen and the living room where the table sat, and where there was just enough room. If you moved the table and pushed the bookshelf 3 feet to the left, for the hutch to stand against the wall, it dominated the space immediately. It made the room look smaller, and somehow, at the same time, more serious. as if a piece of genuine weight had entered a space that had previously been composed entirely of approximations. Mia stood in the doorway and looked at it. "It's very big," she said. "I know." "Why did you want it if it's so big?" Nora looked at it. "Not because it was your great-grandmother's," she said. Which was true, but not the whole truth. She began reattaching the glass doors. The hinges were brass screws, slightly loose from the moving process, and she tightened them with a small screwdriver she found in the kitchen drawer. The left hinge still creaked when the door opened, the same creak it had always made. Something about that sound, that specific unchanged note, hit her suddenly and completely, and the way grief does when you think you have finished with it and it returns without announcement. She stood with the glass door half open and let it come and go, and then she finished tightening the screws and put the screwdriver away. Over the next few days, the Hutch settled into the apartment. She washed the glass fronts and polished the brass handles. She arranged her own things inside, the good plates she had received as a wedding gift and never used, the few items of her grandmother's she had been allowed to take, a small ceramic bowl, a photograph in a silver frame, the rosary that Elena had kept on the bedside table and that Nora had taken before the family arrived to clear the room. She did not tell anyone about the eviction notice, not Hector, not Daniela, not the friends from work who asked how she was doing with the careful tone of people who already suspected the answer. She had a habit of privacy that went back a long way, so a learned conviction that sharing problems invited pity, and pity was a currency she could not afford and did not want. She was working on it. She had increased her evening shifts. She was looking at apartments in neighborhoods further out, less desirable, smaller. She was doing the math again and again, looking for the number that would balance. And in the evenings, when Mia was asleep and the apartment was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with the eviction notice and her calculations, and sometimes looked at the hutch in the other room, dark wood and brass handles catching the light, a piece of her grandmother's life standing in her living room like a visitor who had not yet decided whether to stay. It was Mia who first noticed it. 3 weeks after the hutch arrived, on a Sunday afternoon when Nora was working her second shift, and Mia was at home with their neighbor Elena Rodriguez, who sometimes watched her in exchange for Nora doing her grocery shopping. Mia had been sitting near the hutch drawing, as she often did on Sunday afternoons, spreading her paper and pencils on the floor where the light came in from the window. She was drawing the hutch itself, she told Nora later, because she liked how it looked, how old and serious it seemed, and she had been trying to capture the grain of the wood in pencil, the way the lines curved and darkened in certain places. She had been running her fingers along the bottom of the lower panel, tracing the lines of the wood for her drawing, when she felt something. A section, she said, that felt different. Not rough, not broken. Just different. Like when you press on a wall in one place, and it sounds hollow, and in another place it sounds solid. Except this was with her fingers, and it was in the wood. She told Nora that night when she came home from her shift, at her voice careful and precise, the way it was when she had something important to say and wanted to say it correctly. Nora listened. Then she went to the hutch. She crouched in front of the lower section and ran her hand along the interior of the cabinet in the area Mia had described, the left side near the base, below the lowest shelf. Her fingers moved across the grain and found nothing unusual at first. The wood was smooth, slightly tacky with old finish, cool to the touch. She ran her palm across it again, more slowly. There. Mia was right. Something was different in that section, not in how it looked, which was the same as the rest of the panel, the same grain, the same color, in how it felt. The resistance was subtly wrong. The sound when she tapped it lightly with her knuckle was slightly different, more interior, as if the density of what lay beneath was not the same. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Then she got the small flashlight from the kitchen drawer and shone it along the inside base of the cabinet at a low angle. In that raking light, where shadows lay horizontal and the smallest irregularities became visible, she saw it. A seam, hairline thin, running in a rectangle approximately 12 inches wide and 8 inches tall, so fine it would never have been visible in normal light, sealed with something that had darkened with age to match the surrounding wood almost perfectly. But not perfectly. In the oblique light, it was there. Her hands had gone still. Her breathing had slowed. The apartment was quiet around her, the refrigerator humming, the neighbor's television a murmur through the wall, Mia's breathing slow, and even in the back room. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago. And yet the world felt different in the specific way it feels different when you are standing at the edge of something you cannot yet name. She traced the seam with her fingertip. Rectangle. Regular edges. Intentional. This was not a flaw in the wood or a repair from some old damage. This was designed. Built into the piece from the beginning or added later with extraordinary care. A panel meant to look like part of the cabinet while functioning as something else. A door, she thought, though not a door in any ordinary sense. Something that was meant to remain undetected. She thought of her grandmother's hands on the top edge of the hutch, the habitual gesture of a lifetime. She thought of the sentence spoken when Nora was 12 years old, standing in a kitchen that smelled like cumin and candle wax. Some things carry more than they show. Her heart was doing something irregular now, something between anticipation and fear, and the specific vertigo of a moment in which the ground beneath the familiar shifts and shows you that it was never as solid as it appeared. She pressed her fingers against the center of the rectangle. The panel did not move. She felt along the edges more carefully, looking for a mechanism, a pressure point, something that would yield. On the right edge, near the top corner, her fingertip found a small depression, barely large enough for a single finger, worn smooth with use. She pressed it. Nothing happened. She pressed harder, held the pressure, and felt the faintest mechanical resistance, on some internal tension responding to the force. She pressed and held, counting seconds. 3, 4, 5. And then with a sound so quiet she might have imagined it, a dry whisper of old wood against old wood, the panel shifted. Not outward, not inward. Sideways, fractionally, a small release of pressure, a telling, and then stillness again. Nora sat back. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against her thighs and forced herself to breathe slowly. She looked at the panel. The seam was slightly more visible now, the rectangle marginally more defined, as if the mechanism had partially engaged but not fully released. Something was in there. She was certain of that now. What it was, she did not know. What it meant, she did not know. She thought of Roberto's voice in the dining room. Practical. Sentiment. The dismissal that wore the face of reason. She thought of the boxes and the notepad, and the efficient energy of people who had come to dissolve a life into categories. She thought of how close she had been to letting them take it. How many moments between the suggestion and her refusal. How easily she might have said, yes. She sat in front of the hutch in the dark apartment, one hand resting on the wood, and understood with absolute clarity that she was not alone in this room. Not in the way she could explain to anyone. Not in the presence of ghost sense, which she did not believe in, but in the sense that some things hold memory the way wood holds heat, slowly accumulated, slowly released. Her grandmother had touched this panel, had known this mechanism, had kept this secret for years or decades or more, carrying it into her 80s, into her final days, and had said nothing, left everything behind. because some things carry more than they show. Nora got up and turned the kitchen light on. She went to the drawer where she kept her tools and found the small flashlight again, and a thin letter opener, and a wooden skewer she used for cooking. She set them on the floor beside the hutch and sat down again. It was 9:47 in the evening. Mia would not wake before morning. She had as much time as she needed. She pressed the small depression again and held it, longer this time. And this time, when the mechanism released, she was ready. The panel did not swing open. It released with that same dry whisper and shifted sideways by half an inch, revealing the thinnest sliver of darkness inside, and stayed there. A revealed seam, no more. But now there was a gap, small enough to be invisible in ordinary light, but sufficient to admit the letter opener's blade. Nora slid it in carefully, felt the edge of the inner panel, the thickness of it, the surprising solidity. This was not a thin sheet of plywood, but something substantial, a full inch at least. She used the letter opener as a lever, the gentlest possible pressure, and felt resistance that gradually softened, the protest of old wood against movement it had been denying for a very long time. A second mechanism somewhere inside, a gravity latch perhaps, or simply the friction of decades, yielded by degrees. Then the panel swung inward, not with drama, not with the cinematic release of something spectacular. Quietly, like the answer to a question asked long ago. So a section of the hutch's interior wall, seamless in appearance, hinged on the left, swinging back to reveal a space behind it approximately 6 inches deep and running the full width of the lower cabinet, hidden in the gap between the visible interior and the outer wall of the piece. In the flashlight beam, Nora saw shelves, 2 of them, not wood, but some kind of metal, darkened with age. And on those shelves, objects, the things wrapped in cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old ivory. Packages, some flat, some cylindrical, arranged with the particular care of someone who expected them to wait there for a long time. The flashlight trembled in her hand. She steadied it. She reached in and touched the nearest wrapped object, flat and rectangular, perhaps 14 inches long and 10 wide, and felt through the cloth the rigidity of something that did not flex, something hard and thin and solid. She did not unwrap it. Not yet. She reached past it and touched the next one, cylindrical, heavier, and felt through the wrapping the unmistakable density of something dense and metal. She sat back on the floor and looked at the open panel and the hidden shelves and the wrapped objects sitting in the darkness where they had waited. And she thought about her grandmother, who had crossed a border with almost nothing, who had built a life from nothing, who had lived simply in a modest house on a quiet street and never spoken of wealth or inheritance or anything that might have hinted at this. And she felt the room tilt around her slightly, not with dizziness, but with the vertigo of scale, the feeling of realizing that what you were standing in front of was much larger than it had first appeared. She did not sleep that night. She sat in front of the hutch until the first light came through the kitchen window, the object still wrapped, and still waiting, the panel still open, and she thought about her grandmother's hands and the seam in the wood and the sentence she had been carrying for 26 years. And she waited for morning because the next step required the light. Morning arrived the way mornings arrive when you have not slept, not gradually but all at once, the light simply there where darkness had been, the sounds of the world resuming their ordinary rhythm with indifference to the fact that your night had not been ordinary at all. The refrigerator hummed. A bus passed on the street below. Somewhere in the building a door closed, and Nora sat on the floor in front of the open panel of her grandmother's hutch, still in the clothes she had worn to her second shift the night before, her back against the opposite wall, her knees drawn up, Then she looked at the wrapped objects on the hidden shelves and felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been keeping themselves from doing something all night and is no longer certain why they waited. She had told herself it was caution, patience, the wisdom of not acting in the dark on something she did not yet understand. All of that was true as far as it went. But the deeper truth was simpler and harder to say. She was afraid, not of what might be there, of what might not be, of reaching in and unwrapping those packages and finding nothing that justified what she felt, nothing that matched the weight of the night she had just kept vigil over, nothing but the ordinary keepsakes of an ordinary life, some old photographs, some pieces of inexpensive jewelry, some folded documents that meant nothing to anyone outside the family, and probably not even to everyone inside it. She was afraid of the ordinary, because she had lived inside it for so long, and she had felt, sitting in front of this open panel in the quiet apartment, with her daughter sleeping and the eviction notice on the counter, that she was standing at the edge of something that might be different. And she did not want to learn that it was not. She heard Mia's alarm at 7:15, the small sound of it through the wall, the shuffle of feet, the particular sequence of morning sounds that she had memorized the way you memorize the sounds of anyone you love. She closed the panel. And she did not know why she closed it, not because she had decided anything, but because there was a privacy to what was inside it that she was not ready to share yet, even with Mia, even with herself. She pressed the mechanism, and the panel clicked back into its seamless position, and in the flat morning light it was invisible again, as it had been invisible for however long it had been waiting. She made breakfast. She packed Mia's lunch. She walked her to the corner and watched her get on the school bus, and stood there for a moment after the bus pulled away, the street quiet, the morning cool, and then she went back upstairs. She changed her clothes. She made a cup of coffee that she actually drank this time, and then she went to the hutch and opened it again, and began. The first package she unwrapped was the flat rectangular one, 14 inches by 10, wrapped in cloth that disintegrated slightly at the edges as she unfolded it, the fibers dry and fragile with age. Inside was a hard case, cardboard over wood, its edges reinforced with metal corners that had tarnished to near black. A small brass clasp on the front. She opened it. Inside, nestled in deteriorating velvet the color of pine, lay a mounted display of stamps. Not loose stamps, not an envelope with a stamp in the corner, but a formal mounted collection, stamps arranged in rows behind glass, each one individually hinged on archival paper, each one accompanied by a handwritten notation in a script so fine she had to lean close to read it. The stamps themselves were old. She could see that immediately, could see it in the printing style and the denominations and the faces depicted on them, faces from another era. Some were single stamps, isolated in their paper mounts. Others were pairs or blocks of 4, their alignment precise, and their margins even on all sides, which she somehow understood mattered, though she could not have said why. She set the case carefully on the floor beside her and reached for the next package. Also flat, also rectangular, though smaller. This one was wrapped more elaborately, layers of cloth, and then a layer of what appeared to be waxed paper beneath, as if someone had been trying to protect it from moisture. Inside was a leather envelope, dark brown, its surface still supple despite its age. She undid the ties and opened it. Documents. She lifted them out and spread them on the floor with the careful attention of someone handling paper that has earned its fragility honestly. They were in Spanish, which she could read, though the handwriting was formal and old-fashioned, and some of the vocabulary unfamiliar. Property records, she thought. Something about land, names and dates, and figures written in the meticulous hand of someone for whom precision was a professional obligation. There were several pages, some stamped with official seals whose impressions had faded to shadows, some with signatures that meant nothing to her yet. At the bottom of the leather envelope, a smaller paper, folded 3 times. She opened it and found a letter, written in her grandmother's hand. She recognized it immediately, the particular way Elena shaped her letters, the slightly exaggerated loop on the lower case on Isabioi, to the way she crossed her T's with a stroke that curved upward at the right end, as if the letter were reaching for something. The letter was dated 22 years ago. Nora read it standing there on the floor of her apartment, with the morning light coming through the window, and she read it 3 times, and then she sat down because her legs were not steady. The letter was addressed to no one by name. It began in the way of someone writing to an unknown future reader, now knowing the reader would understand the context when they arrived at it. "My grandmother brought these with her," Elena had written, referring to her own grandmother, Nora's great-great-grandmother, a woman named Soledad, who had left Spain in 1939 and arrived in South America with almost nothing, which was what everyone said, which was what everyone believed, and which was, the letter made clear, not entirely true. Soledad had carried the stamps in a case sewn into the lining of a coat. She had not known precisely what they were worth. She had known only that her father, a man who had been a serious philatelist before the war, had pressed the case into her hands and told her that if she ever needed it, she should find someone who knew what to look for, and that what they found would be enough to take care of the rest of her life. She had never used them, whether out of loyalty to their memory or superstition, or simply because she had managed to survive without them. The letter did not say. She had passed them to Elena with the same instruction her father had given her, "If you ever need it." Elena had also never used them. She had kept the case in the hutch for 41 years. She had told no one. She wrote in the letter that she had meant to tell Nora directly, had planned to several times, and each time something had stopped her, some combination of not wanting to create expectation and not knowing how to begin a conversation about things that had been silent for so long. She wrote that she hoped whoever found this would be the right person, which was perhaps a strange thing to write, except that Nora understood it completely, because some part of her grandmother had understood that the hutch would find the person who needed it rather than the person who went looking. The letter closed with a line that made Nora's eyes sting and then overflow because she recognized it and could hear it in her grandmother's voice as clearly as if she were in the room. "I kept the hutch because some things carry more than they show. Now you know how much." Nora sat on the floor of her apartment for a long time. She was crying, and she did not try to stop it. And it was not the soft, polite crying of someone managing their feelings, but the other kind, the kind that comes when something breaks open that has been sealed for too long. She let it happen, and when it was finished, she wiped her face with her sleeve and picked up the stamp case again and looked at the stamps, which sat in their mounted rows with the complete indifference of objects that have no knowledge of what they are worth. She did not know what they were worth. She knew almost nothing about stamps, nothing about philately, nothing about what made one piece of paper with a picture on it worth $10 and another worth 10,000. But she knew that her great-great-grandmother's father had thought these were worth hiding in a coat lining. She knew that Elena had kept them for 41 years in a secret compartment. She knew that the letter described them in terms that suggested something significant. She also knew that she needed to find out before she let herself feel the full weight of what this might be, because hope in the absence of knowledge was its own kind of danger. She reached back into the hidden space and took out the remaining packages. She unwrapped each one with slow hands. A second stamp case, smaller than the first, 6 stamps in 2 rows, each one isolated in its mount, each one annotated in the same careful script. She looked at the stamps. Some were the color of old roses, their printing precise and detailed. Tiny images of buildings and figures rendered in miniature, with a craft that was hard to look away from. A cylindrical object wrapped in cloth, and then in another layer of cloth inside that, heavy and dense. She peeled back the wrappings to find a small tube of metal, sealed at both ends, and inside it, when she carefully pried one end open, a rolled document. She unrolled it with the reverence of someone handling something they are afraid to damage. It was a certificate of some kind, printed in 2 languages, one of which she recognized as German, with signatures and a date and a reference number. She could not read it fully, but she could see it related to the stamps. That much was clear from the format and the arrangement of numbers and names. A flat case similar to the first but smaller, containing not stamps, but what appeared to be a single envelope, yellowed and intact, with a stamp affixed to it in the upper right corner, the envelope itself still sealed. On the stamp's cancellation mark visible, a date she could make out as belonging to the late 19th century. An entire mailed envelope preserved. And at the back of the second shelf, a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry box, its wood dark and smooth, with a sliding lid. She slid it open. Inside, wrapped individually in tissue paper so old it was nearly translucent, were coins. Gold coins. She lifted one and held it to the light, and looked at the face on it. A profile she did not recognize, lettering around the edge she could not read. She turned it over. The reverse showed an image she also did not recognize. The coin was heavy for its size, warm from her hand already, undeniably gold. There were 11 of them. She sat with everything spread around her on the floor of her apartment and looked at it all, and she was very quiet inside in a way that had nothing to do with calm. And she was quiet the way a person is quiet, when they are in the presence of something that requires their entire attention, when the ordinary noise of internal life stops because all available resources are directed outward. Then she got up, photographed everything carefully with her phone, wrapped it all back in the cloths, placed everything back in the hidden compartment, and pressed the panel closed. She drank the rest of her coffee, which was cold. She looked up the name of an expert on her phone for a long time before she found the right search terms, and when she did, she sat very still for another few minutes, reading what she found. Then she called in sick to both jobs for the first time in 3 years. The first person she called was not an expert. It was a woman named Gloria, who worked at the hospital laundry with her on morning shifts, and who was the closest thing Nora had to a friend, in the way that people who work long hours together become friends, not by choice exactly, but by proximity and mutual endurance. She called Gloria not to tell her what she had found, but to ask a question, and the question was whether Gloria's nephew, who worked at a university and had some connection to art and antiques, I might know someone Nora could talk to without asking too many questions in return. Gloria said she would find out and call back. While she waited, Nora sat at the kitchen table and thought about what she knew and what she did not know and what she needed to find out before she could know anything with any certainty. She knew she had stamps, old stamps, carefully preserved, accompanied by what appeared to be some kind of provenance documentation. She knew she had gold coins. She knew she had a sealed envelope that was itself apparently significant enough to be stored alongside everything else. She did not know the value of any of it. She did not know the legal status of any of it, whether it belonged to her outright, whether there were claims she had not considered, whether the history of these objects had complications she could not yet see. She did not know whether the documents in the leather envelope had implications beyond the personal, so whether the property records she could not fully read referred to something that still existed somewhere in the world. There were things she understood about herself in this moment, She understood that she was a woman with almost no money, facing eviction, with a child to protect, and she had just found something that might be extraordinarily valuable, or might be much less than it appeared. And the difference between those two outcomes could not be resolved by sitting on the floor of her apartment and feeling things about it. It required knowledge. It required caution. It required someone who knew what they were looking at. It also required silence. She thought about Roberto, about Hector, about the family in that dining room, their efficient appraisals, their calculations, their collective certainty that she had made an emotional and impractical decision. And she thought about what Roberto would say if he knew, what he would do. She thought about the split of the grandmother's savings account and how readily the family had accepted that arrangement. And she understood that whatever was in the hutch had been intended for whoever found it, which the letter made clear, and not for whoever happened to be related to whoever found it. She kept this thought to herself. She would keep it to herself for as long as necessary. Now Gloria called back in the afternoon. Her nephew knew a woman named Iris Chen, who was a senior specialist at a regional auction house that dealt in estate contents, antiques, and collectibles. She had been in the field for 20 years and was known for being straight with people, which was not a universal quality in her profession. Gloria gave Nora the number. Nora wrote it on the inside cover of a notebook and looked at it for 10 minutes before dialing. Now Iris Chen had the voice of someone who had heard many things and been surprised by fewer of them than most people. She listened to Nora's description, which was careful and factual and did not include the words grandmother or hutch or eviction notice, just a description of objects she had come into possession of and wanted evaluated. She asked a few precise questions about the stamp cases, the condition of the mounts, the annotation style, so whether Nora could describe any of the subjects depicted on the stamps themselves. Nora pulled the hutch open and described what she saw through the glass-fronted cases. Iris was quiet for a moment after the description. Then she said, "Can you photograph everything and send it to me today?" Nora said yes. Another pause. "When you said the annotations were in the case with the stamps, can you tell me exactly what style of handwriting? And is there a reference number anywhere?" Nora opened the case and looked. There was a number. She read it. Iris was quiet again for longer this time. "I would like to come and look at these in person," she said. "Would tomorrow work?" Tomorrow worked. She came at 10 in the morning. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair, pulled back simply, and glasses she wore on a chain that she put on and took off depending on whether she was looking at something near or far. And she carried a leather bag that she set on the floor without ceremony and opened with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to working in other people's spaces. She looked at the hutch first, without touching it, walking slowly around it and running her eyes along its surfaces with attention that was clearly professional. "Interesting piece," she said. "Old. European construction." She looked at the lower section for a moment longer than everything else. Nora opened the panel. Now Iris did not react dramatically. She was not the reacting dramatically kind. She looked at the hidden space and the shelves and the objects on them, and she said, "May I?" And when Nora nodded, she put on a pair of thin cotton gloves and began removing items one by one, setting them on the table, which Nora had cleared and covered with a clean cloth. She worked in silence, handling each piece with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom objects have weight beyond the physical. When everything was out and arranged on the table, she took out a magnifying loupe from her bag and began examining the stamps. She started with the first case and moved through it methodically, spending considerable time on certain specimens and less on others, her face giving nothing away. She examined the annotations. She looked at the certificate from the cylinder. She opened her laptop and consulted something Nora could not see from where she stood across the room. It was 40 minutes before she spoke. She set the loop down and took her glasses off and looked at Nora directly. "I want to be careful with what I say to you, because I don't want to overstate this," she said. "And I also want to be honest with you, because that's the only way I know how to do this work. So I'm going to tell you what I see, and then I want you to ask me anything you need to ask." Nora sat down. "What you have here," Iris said, looking back at the table, "is a stamp collection of considerable rarity. The first case alone contains several specimens that I would classify as significant." She indicated the stamps in the top row of the first case. "These 4 are from a German series printed in 1918. They're inverted center errors, which means the central image was printed upside down relative to the frame. Printing errors of this type are extraordinarily rare. The documentation in this case, these annotations, indicate these came from a private collection assembled before the war. The provenance notes are exceptionally detailed." She set the first case down and picked up the second. "This is potentially even more significant." She held the loop over a single stamp, rose-colored, its printing dense and intricate. "This, if it is what the annotation claims it to be, and I want to be careful again because this requires formal authentication, but if it is what I think it is from a series produced in 1855 in the Swedish state. There are very few of them known to exist in this condition." Nora said nothing. She was watching Iris's hands, the careful, measured way they moved. Iris put the case down and picked up the sealed envelope, examining it through the loop without touching the stamp itself. "The stamp on this envelope appears to be a British Guiana 1-cent magenta," she said. Her voice was level. "There is only one known example of this stamp in existence. It sold at auction in 2014 for $9.4 million. The room was very quiet. Nora heard the refrigerator hum. She heard a car on the street below. "I'm not saying this is that stamp," Iris said. "I'm saying it appears consistent with it. And I am saying that if it is a previously undiscovered example, the implications are significant." She paused. "This would require authentication at the highest level. Expert examination, chemical analysis, historical provenance research. Nothing can be confirmed without that process. But I want you to understand why I'm being careful. Because if I said to you, this is worth what I think it might be worth, and I was wrong, I would have done you a great harm. And if I said to you, this is probably nothing, and I was wrong, I would have done you an even greater harm." "The coins," Nora said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. Iris moved to the coins, which she examined one by one with the loop. She consulted her laptop again. "On Spanish gold escudos," she said. "Late 17th century, based on the monarch's profile. These are numismatic collectibles. Not extraordinarily rare individually, but in this condition and this quantity, with potential provenance, connecting them to a private collection with documented history, they have meaningful value." She named a range. It was a range that started at a number Nora had not expected. "And the documents," Nora said. Iris looked at the papers from the leather envelope carefully. "The property records are in Spanish," she said. "I can read basic Spanish, but you'll need someone with expertise in historical land law to assess these fully. What I can tell you is that these appear to be deeds, or title documents relating to property in Catalonia, and based on what they describe and the dates involved, these may have legal implications that go beyond the monetary value of the stamps and coins. This is a different kind of expert, a different process." She sat back and looked at Nora. "How did you come to have these?" she asked. Nora told her. Not everything, but the essential outline. The grandmother, the hutch, the hidden compartment, the letter. Iris listened. When Nora finished, Iris nodded once. The collection appears to have been assembled over multiple generations and preserved with intent, she said. The annotation suggests someone with serious knowledge of philately who was documenting everything carefully. The certificate is a German authenticity document, issued by a recognized philatelic society before 1940. That's significant for provenance. It places these stamps in a known collection before the war. She paused. "I want to help you do this correctly," she said. "That means authentication, legal assessment, and proper appraisal before any decisions are made. It also means discretion on my part, which I'm committed to. But it also means I have to tell you that you should speak to no one about this until you've spoken to a lawyer. Not family, not friends. No one." Nora looked at her. "I already know that," she said quietly. Iris held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Good." She began carefully replacing each item in its wrappings. "I can refer you to 2 authentication specialists, one for the stamps and one for the coins. Both are people I trust completely. The legal situation is more complicated. Depending on the country of origin and the history of the collection, there may be questions around cultural property law, around wartime repatriation claims, around inheritance law in multiple jurisdictions. You'll need a specialist in estate and art law. I can give you a name." She wrote 3 names on a card and handed it to Nora. Then she looked at the Hutch again. She was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother kept this for 41 years, she said. "Yes." "And never used it." "No." Iris seemed to consider this. "I've been doing this for 20 years, she said. "I've seen people who needed money sell things for a fraction of what they were worth because they couldn't wait. And I've seen people hold on to things and let them sit. And sometimes that was wisdom, and sometimes it was just fear." She looked at Nora. "Your grandmother knew what this was. Not the exact figures, maybe, not the current market, but she knew it was significant. And she kept it for 41 years and gave it to the person she trusted with it. That's not a small thing." Nora looked at the Hutch, the wood dark and warm in the morning light, the brass handles, the creak on the left hinge. "Some things carry more than they show." "I know," she said. "The authentication process took 11 days. 11 days during which Nora went to work and packed Mia's lunch and signed permission slips and avoided her family's calls when she could, and when she couldn't, she gave nothing away. And she sat with the eviction notice every night and told herself to wait, just wait, because the number at the bottom of the notice was 90 days, and she still had time. She still had time, and the thing that she was waiting for was still being counted. She had taken the stamp cases and the coins and the documents to the specialists Iris had named, carrying them in a bag that never left her hands, riding the bus to appointments in offices that smelled of old paper and controlled air, sitting across tables from men and women who used equipment she did not recognize, and vocabulary she had to ask them to explain. She had not told Mia where she was going. She had not told anyone. And she had paid the consultation fees on the last of a credit card and told herself it was the last time she would use credit for something uncertain. She had contacted the estate law attorney, a woman named Priya Mehta, whose offices were in a building downtown near the building where Nora cleaned offices in the evenings, which was a coincidence she tried not to read too much into. So Priya had listened to the outline of the situation with the calm of someone who had heard unusual things before and understood that the unusual required the same methodology as everything else: careful attention, thorough documentation, patient procedure. She had asked for copies of the letter, the property documents, and the certificate. She had begun research. She had said nothing about outcome because it was too early for that. On the 11th day, Nora received 3 emails within the span of 2 hours. The first was from the philatelic authentication specialist, a man named Dr. Gareth Owens, who had the careful formal prose of someone who had spent a career being precise in writing, because the difference between a word placed correctly and a word placed carelessly could be measured in tens of thousands of dollars. He had examined the stamps from both cases and the sealed envelope under spectroscopic analysis and ultraviolet light and physical magnification, and had compared them against known examples and historical records. His findings were as follows. The 4 1918 inverted center errors were authentic. They were in exceptional condition given their age. Based on comparable recent sales and current market appetite for rare German philatelic material, he placed their estimated value at between $1.2 and $1.8 million for the set. The 1855 stamp from the second case was authentic and was, in his professional assessment, one of a known small number of surviving examples of its type in the world. It was in extraordinarily fine condition compared to other known examples. He provided a range. The low end of the range was $4 million. The high end, dependent on auction conditions and buyer competition, was significantly higher. Then the third item. He had examined the sealed envelope and the stamp affixed to it, with the full range of analytical tools available to him. He had consulted with a colleague in London who was among the world's leading authorities on this specific material. He had cross-referenced against photographic records, spectral analyses, and historical auction records. He wrote 3 sentences that Nora read 4 times before she was certain she understood them. The stamp on the sealed envelope is consistent in every measurable respect with a genuine British Guiana 1-cent magenta. The material composition, the printing characteristics, the color, and the physical dimensions all match the known example. If the provenance documentation and historical chain of custody can be established, this represents a second known example of the rarest stamp in the world, with an estimated value at auction in the range of $12 to $18 million. Now Nora sat at the kitchen table and looked at the words on her screen for a very long time. The second email was from the numismatic specialist. The 11 gold coins were Spanish gold escudos, as Iris had suggested, dating from the reign of Carlos II, late 17th century, minted in Mexico City, based on the assayer's marks. They were in exceptional preservation. Total estimated value for the collection, accounting for the historical provenance documentation and the rarity of finding this number of examples together in this condition, was between $300,000 and $450,000. The third email was from Priya Mehta. It was longer than the other 2. It addressed the property documents from the leather envelope, which Priya had translated and assessed by a specialist in historical Spanish land law. The documents described a rural property in the province of Girona in Catalonia. The land had been in the family of Soledad's father before the war. Priya's assessment was that the legal situation was complex, that wartime property seizures in Spain had a complicated legal history, that there were repatriation frameworks that might apply, and that she wanted to discuss next steps in person. But there was one sentence near the end of the email that Nora kept returning to. Based on current land valuations in the region described and the documented acreage, the property, if the claim can be established, has a current estimated value of between 40 and 70 million euros. Nora got up from the table and walked to the window and stood looking at the street below. A woman was walking a dog. A child was riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. Across the street, a man was loading boxes into a van. The world was doing what it always did, proceeding with complete indifference to what was happening in any particular apartment, on any particular floor, indifferent to eviction notices and stamp collections and letters written in a grandmother's hand, and the weight of what a single life can carry for decades in a hidden compartment, in a piece of furniture that everyone else wanted to sell. She stood at the window for a long time. Her hands were pressed flat against the glass, and she could feel the cold of it through her palms. Her breathing was slow. She was not crying, though she had expected to be. She was something beyond crying, something on the other side of it, in the place you reach when you have been in a state of emergency for long enough that relief does not arrive as emotion, but as something quieter, a simple mechanical release, like a lock opening. The numbers in those 3 emails, taken together, added up to something in a range that Nora had never associated with her own life, and something in the range of $80 to $120 million, potentially, depending on the property claim, depending on auction conditions, depending on a dozen variables that Priya and the specialists had all been careful to qualify. Not certain, not guaranteed, dependent on process and time and the resolution of legal questions that had no quick answers, but real, documented, verified by experts who had no stake in the outcome. She thought about her grandmother, Elena, who had crossed a border with almost nothing, or so everyone believed, who had built a life in a modest house and cooked meals that smelled like warmth and spoken words that carried weight and kept a secret for 41 years, with the patience of a woman who understood that some things required the right person at the right time, who had said some things carry more than they show, and then smiled in the way she smiled when she was keeping something. She thought about Soledad, who had carried the stamps in the lining of a coat and had never used them, had passed them forward instead, another generation's inheritance, another link in a chain that stretched back to a man who had assembled a collection in a country about to be torn apart and had pressed his most precious things into his daughter's hands and said, "If you ever need it." She thought about the Hutch, standing in the dining room of the house in Millfield for 31 years, absorbing the light and the years, saw outlasting everyone who had dismissed it. Standing in her own apartment now, dark wood and brass handles, the left hinge still creaking on the same note. And she thought about Roberto in the dining room, his efficient appraisal, his word for what she had done. Sentiment. She took her hands off the glass and let the window hold the cold without her. Then she turned around and went to call Priya Mehta. Priya Mehta's office was on the 14th floor of a building that Nora had cleaned 3 nights a week for 2 years. She had emptied the bins in the hallway outside the frosted glass door, with Mehta and Associates printed on it in gold lettering more times than she could count. She had run a mop along the tile in front of that door and never once imagined walking through it as a client. The world arranges these kinds of symmetries with complete indifference to whether you are ready for them. Priya was a compact woman of 50, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to let other people fill the silence first. She had dark eyes behind narrow glasses and a desk that was organized in a way that communicated she had thought about every object's placement. She listened to Nora for the better part of an hour, asked precise questions, made notes in a way that suggested she wrote only what mattered and nothing else. When Nora had finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but in the way of someone arranging a large and complex structure in her mind before beginning to describe it. "The situation has several layers," she said. "Let me take them in order." She took them in order. The stamps and coins were straightforward in legal terms. They had been in Elena's possession for decades, inherited from Soledad, through a lineage that was documentable. And Elena's letter constituted a clear statement of testamentary intent. The hidden compartment and the manner of concealment were unusual, but not legally problematic. The objects belonged to Nora. The provenance documentation, specifically the German certificate, and the detailed annotations, actually strengthened the case for their value and their legitimate ownership history. There were no competing claims she could identify. "On the stamps and coins," Priya said, "you are on solid ground. The property in Catalonia was more complicated. Property seized or abandoned during the Spanish Civil War and the Franco era had a legal history that was dense and contested, and that the Spanish government had addressed imperfectly through legislation in the 1980s and again in the early 2000s. The documents Nora had were strong evidence of pre-war ownership by her ancestors' family, but strong evidence was not the same as a clear title. Priya had a colleague in Barcelona who specialized in exactly this area. The process would take time. It would also cost money, which Priya understood was a constraint, and she proposed a fee arrangement tied to outcome rather than hours, because she had read the situation correctly without being told. There was also the question of the sealed envelope. Priya raised it carefully. The potential existence of a second British Guiana 1-cent magenta was not a matter that would remain private once the authentication process moved to its formal stages. Auction houses would need to be involved. International philatelic organizations would need to verify. There would be interest from collectors, from institutions, from the press. The world of rare stamps was small and intensely attentive, and a discovery of this magnitude would not be containable indefinitely. "We need to control the timeline," Priya said. "Not hide it. That's not possible and not advisable. But sequence it. The property claim in Spain needs to be filed before any public announcement about the stamps, because the announcement will attract attention to you and to everything connected to you, and we want the legal framework in place before that happens." She paused. "Also," she said, "is there family who might have a competing claim to any of this?" Nora thought about the dining room, on Roberto's voice, the word sentiment like a synonym for foolishness, the arrangement they had made, her grandmother's small savings account given away in exchange for an old cabinet no one else wanted. She told Priya about the family conversation, the voluntary relinquishment of the savings account, the fact that the Hutch had been taken by Nora in lieu of that money, with the full knowledge of the family present. Priya listened, made a note. "That arrangement," she said, while informal, establishes a clear record of who took the Hutch and in what capacity. The letter from your grandmother naming you specifically is more important. But I want you to understand that when this becomes public, there will be people who claim they would have wanted the Hutch if they had known, and we need to be prepared for that." Nora understood. She had been prepared for that since the moment she read the letter on the floor of her apartment, since before that, since the dining room, since Roberto had said sentiment, and Carmen had said, "Where would you even put it?" and Hector had said, "It's not your decision alone." She had been prepared for it since she was 38 years old, and tired, and sitting at a kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and an eviction notice, and the only thing standing between her and the erasure of everything her grandmother had preserved was a decision made from something the family had dismissed as weakness. "We're prepared," she said. The legal process moved with the particular rhythm of formal procedures, which is to say it moved slowly and then in bursts, with long stretches of waiting interrupted by concentrated periods of action. Priya filed the property claim in Spain through her colleague in Barcelona, a man named Jordi Puig, who sent emails at what appeared to be all hours of the day and night, and who communicated with a compressed efficiencies that Nora found reassuring. Or the philatelic specialists completed their formal authentication reports and submitted them to the relevant international bodies. A numismatic authentication certificate was issued for the coins. The eviction notice expired. She had spoken to the landlord and explained, without specifics, that her financial situation was about to change and asked for an extension. He had given her 30 days, which felt like grace, but was actually just practicality. Finding a new tenant took time too. Those 30 days passed in the suspended state of someone waiting for a verdict, going through the ordinary motions of life, while understanding that the ordinary was about to become unrecognizable. She paid off the eviction debt on day 22. She did not do it dramatically. She transferred the money from an account Priya had helped her establish, the first proceeds from the sale of 3 of the gold coins, which had gone to a private buyer through a numismatic dealer at the lower end of the estimated range, and still represented more money than Nora had seen in any account with her name on it in her entire life. She paid the landlord. She paid the overdue utilities. She paid the credit card balances that had been sitting on her chest for years, like weather she had stopped noticing because it had been there for so long. She did not tell anyone. Not yet. She kept going to work. Both jobs. The same shifts, the same commute, the same corridors and the same machinery and the same invisibility. She did this not because she had to, but because she wasn't ready. Because the gap between what she knew and what the world knew felt like something that needed to be maintained carefully. A pressure differential that could not be released all at once without consequence. She needed the legal structure to be further along. She needed Priya's timeline. She needed to be certain before she became visible. She also needed Mia to be ready. She had told her daughter some of it, not the numbers, not the full scope, but the fact of it. That great-grandmother Elena had left them something important that had been hidden in the hutch, that it was going to change things. Mia had listened with the serious attention she brought to things she understood were important, and had asked 2 questions. The first was whether they still had to move. The second was whether they could get a dog. Nora had said no to the first one, and she was thinking about it to the second. And Mia had nodded and gone back to her drawing, and Nora had looked at her daughter's calm face and felt something she could not name, something that was not relief exactly, and not gratitude exactly, but was made of both of those things, and also of something else, a recognition of the particular luck of having raised a child who met the world with steadiness. Well, that was not an accident. That was something Nora had built. One ordinary day at a time, one packed lunch and signed permission slip and attended school event at a time, in the years when there was nothing to build it from except the decision to keep going. The formal auction announcement came 8 weeks after Nora had first called Iris Chen. It was released by the auction house that Iris worked with, taught in coordination with the international philatelic authentication bodies and in consultation with Priya on a Thursday morning. The announcement described the discovery of a private stamp collection of exceptional rarity, including authenticated examples of 19th and 20th century issues previously unknown to the market, and noted the particular significance of one item that had been submitted for authentication as a potential second example of the British Guiana 1-cent magenta. The response was not gradual. It was immediate and complete, the way a stone dropped in still water produces rings that reach every edge at once. Within hours, the story had moved from philatelic industry publications to general news. By evening, it was on the front pages of several international outlets. The phrase, "rarest stamp in the world," appeared in dozens of headlines. The phrase, "private collection kept secret for generations," appeared in nearly as many. Nora's name was not in any of it. That had been Priya's condition, and the auction house had agreed to it without significant argument, because the story was extraordinary enough without the personal details, and because a seller who had been properly advised understood that privacy was an asset in the early stages of something like this. There would be time for names later. For now, the world knew about the stamps. It did not know about Nora. Her family knew by Saturday. Roberto called first. She watched his name appear on her screen and let the call go to voicemail, and then listened to the message, which was brief and controlled in the way of someone who was working hard at controlled. He had seen the news, he said. He wanted to talk. He didn't ask directly whether she was the person the news was about, but the question was present in every word around the one he didn't use. She called him back that evening. He answered immediately. She could hear in the quality of the silence before he spoke that he had been sitting with the phone nearby. "Is it you?" he said. "The stamps?" The collection? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. In the hutch, he said. In Grandma's hutch. Yes. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than she had heard from him before. Roberto was rarely at a loss. He was a man who moved through the world with the assurance of someone who had always found words before he needed them, and who had never had to sit with a silence that he did not know how to fill. This silence was unfamiliar. She let him sit in it. We were all there, he said finally, in that dining room, all of us looking at it. Yes. You said you wanted it, and we said, she waited. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. They both knew what had been said in that dining room, knew it completely, knew every word and every tone and the expression on his face when he had used the word sentiment. And knowing was sufficient. What do you need? She said. She said it without bitterness. This surprised her slightly, the absence of the bitterness she would have expected to feel in this moment. The moment she had imagined during the long weeks of waiting when she had allowed herself to imagine it. The bitterness was simply not there. There was something else in its place, something quieter and more solid. The particular confidence of a person who made the right decision and knew it and did not need to perform the knowing for anyone. I don't know, he said. I think I just needed to hear your voice. She thought about that. She thought about the family in the dining room, their efficient calculations, their reasonable certainties, the things they had said that had been meant practically and had landed as diminishments. She thought about how none of them had been villains. They had been people doing what people do when they have learned to measure everything by what it can be sold for, because that was the education their lives had given them, the same education her life had tried to give her, and she had refused part of the lesson, and the refusal had looked like foolishness until it didn't. You can come and see it, she said, before the auction. I'll arrange it with Iris. Another pause. The Iris who, he began. The specialist, yes. He was quiet again. Then he said, I'm sorry, Nora. And the words had the weight of something he had been carrying for a while, something that had been getting heavier since Thursday morning. I should have listened. She looked at the hutch across the room, the dark wood in the evening light, the brass handles, the particular presence of it, unchanged, unhurried, exactly what it had always been. I know, she said, and she meant it without sharpness, because sorry was sufficient, and she did not need more from him than that, and she did not need to extract anything from this moment except what it actually was, which was a man who had been wrong and knew it and was saying so. That was enough. That was more than enough. She called Hector and Carmen herself rather than waiting for them to call her. She called Daniela, who cried and said she was so happy for her and asked if she could see the stamps sometime. Not for any reason, except that she just wanted to see them. And Nora said yes. She called Gloria from the laundry facility and told her that the nephew's connection had led somewhere remarkable, and that she was not going to need to keep both jobs much longer. And Gloria made a sound that was part crying and part laughing that made Nora smile in the way you smile, when the world occasionally manages to be the right size. The auction was held 6 weeks later in New York, at a house that occupied a building on the Upper East Side, where the ceilings were high and the light was controlled, and everything about the space communicated that significant things happened here regularly. Nora sat in the room with Iris beside her and Priya at the end of the row, and she watched the bidding on the 4 German inverted errors open at a number that was already above what she earned in a year, and climb from there with a steadiness that had its own kind of momentum. Buyers in the room and on the phone and online, a global audience assembled around a set of 4 small pieces of paper that her great-great-grandmother had carried across an ocean in a coat lining, and that had waited in a hidden compartment for 4 decades to be found by the right person at the right time. The inverted errors sold for $1.6 million. The 1855 stamp sold for $4.9 million. In a bidding process that lasted 11 minutes and felt like its own kind of weather. The room charged with the particular electricity of people who understood what they were looking at and were willing to pay for that understanding. The British Guiana 1-cent magenta, the second known example, authenticated and documented with the full weight of international philatelic authority. The stamp that had been carried in a sealed envelope inside a hidden compartment, inside a walnut hutch, in a modest house in Millfield for 31 years. And before that in houses and cases, and the keeping of women who had understood that it needed to be preserved for someone who would know when to use it. Sold after 22 minutes of bidding to a private collector whose identity was not disclosed, for $14.3 million. When the gavel came down, Nora did not react in the way she had seen people react in films about moments like this, the gasping and the tears and the collapse of composure. She sat very still. She felt Iris's hand close around hers briefly, and then release, a professional gesture of acknowledgement, and she heard Priya make a small sound beside her. The room moved on to the next lot with the practiced efficiency of an auction house, and Nora sat in her chair and let the number settle into her, not with drama, but with the quiet solidity of something becoming real. The coins had been sold privately in advance, through the numismatic dealer, at $380,000. The total from the stamps and coins, before fees and taxes and Priya's percentage and the various costs of the process, was just over $21 million. The property claim in Spain was still proceeding. Jordi Puig had filed the necessary documents. The Spanish government's response to such claims was slow and not guaranteed, but Priya believed the documentation was sufficient to establish a legitimate claim, and that the process, while it would take years, might have a reasonable probability of resolution. The land itself, agricultural and coastal, in a region that had seen significant development in the decades since the war, had a current valuation that Priya described as substantial, which Nora had learned was Priya's word for very large. She did not count that money. She did not allow herself to count it, because it was not yet real, and might not be, and she had learned the hard way the cost of counting on things that were not yet in your hands. She filed it in the part of her mind that was reserved for possibilities rather than certainties, and she turned her attention to what was certain. What was certain was enough. She did not do it all at once. This was a choice, a deliberate and considered one, made in conversation with Priya and with herself. Over the weeks between the auction and the morning, she woke up and understood that she was no longer the person she had been on the night she sat at the kitchen table, with the eviction notice and the cold cup of tea. She gave notice at the laundry facility first. She did it on a Tuesday, speaking to the supervisor directly, giving 2 weeks' notice the way you do when you are leaving a job that you did with integrity, even when it cost you things, because the integrity did not stop being important just because the circumstances had changed. Gloria walked her out on the last day, and they stood on the sidewalk in the cold, and Gloria said, "You were always too good for this place," and Nora said no. I was exactly right for this place, which she meant, because the place had kept her and Mia alive for years, and that was not nothing. That was not something you left behind, as if it had been beneath you. She gave notice at the office cleaning job the following week. She cleaned the hallway outside Priya's office for the last time and felt the symmetry of it without needing to make anything of it. She did not move immediately. The apartment that had felt too small for too long was still the apartment where Mia had grown up, where the light came through the kitchen window in the mornings, where the hutch stood against the wall in the space between the kitchen and the living room. And she was not ready to leave it yet. She understood that this was not sentiment, but something more specific. The recognition that the life she had built inside these walls had not been a failure waiting to be corrected, but something that had its own completeness, its own hard-won integrity, and that leaving it should be done with care rather than relief. She found an apartment 3 months later, in a neighborhood with trees on the street, and a school nearby that Mia visited twice before deciding she liked it. The new apartment had a dining room, a real one, with walls on all 4 sides, and space enough for a table and chairs, and a large piece of furniture against the far wall. The hutch was the first thing moved in. The movers had the same trouble with the doorway as the first time, had to remove the glass doors and angle the piece and ease it through. The left hinge still creaked when the glass door opened. The same note. Unchanged and unhurried and exactly itself. She placed it against the wall in the dining room and stood back and looked at it, and thought about her grandmother, placing her hand on the top edge, the habitual gesture of a lifetime. She reached out and rested her own hand there. The wood was cool and smooth under her palm, the grain rising slightly under her fingers, the particular living texture of something old and enduring. She thought about Soledad, who had crossed a border with what everyone thought was almost nothing, and who had known the whole time what was sewn into the lining of her coat, who had survived and built a life and passed the collection forward rather than using it herself, perhaps because the needing never felt sufficient, or perhaps because she understood something about timing that other people don't. That some things are not for the moment you are in, but for the moment that is coming. So the moment you cannot see yet, the moment when the person who receives it will be exactly the right person at exactly the right time. She thought about the chain of women who had carried this forward. Soledad to Elena to Nora, each one holding it, each one deciding this was not the moment, each one trusting that the moment would come and that the right hands would be there when it did. She thought about Mia, the 9 years old and steady, and already the kind of person who noticed things that other people missed, who had run her fingers along the grain of the wood because she was drawing it and wanted to feel what she was looking at, and had found the seam because she was paying the particular quality of attention that the world rarely rewards, and that she had anyway because it was simply who she was. She thought about how close it had come, how many moments between the suggestion in the dining room and her refusal, how easily she might have said yes, taken the savings account money, let Roberto's friend's buyer come and carry the hutch away to somewhere it would never be opened, never be understood, its secret preserved forever in perfect, useless darkness. She had not said yes. She had said, "I want it," with the stubbornness of someone who could not have explained precisely why, except that something inside her had recognized something inside the wood, and the recognition had been stronger than the practical, and the practical had not won. That was the thing she carried forward. Not as a lesson exactly, because lessons suggest a moral you can package and distribute, and this wasn't that kind of thing, but as a knowledge, private and specific, and hers, that the dismissed thing, the overlooked thing, the thing that does not justify itself in the language the room is speaking, is sometimes the most important thing in the room. That the capacity to say, "I want it," when everyone else says, "Let it go," is not sentimentality, and not foolishness, but a form of intelligence that has its own name, one that takes longer to prove, but that, when proven, requires no defense. She had not needed to say that to Roberto. She had not needed to say it to anyone. It had been sufficient to know it herself, standing in front of the hutch with her hand on the wood, while the room offered her practical reasons to let go. The legal notice from Spain arrived 14 months after Preya had filed the claim. It was not a resolution, not yet, but it was a significant step, an acknowledgement of the claim's validity under the relevant repatriation framework, an invitation to proceed to the formal verification stage. Jordi Puig sent a message with 3 exclamation points, which, from a man of his compressed communication style, was the equivalent of anyone else calling in tears. The process would continue. It would take more years. But it was moving in the direction of yes. Nora read the notice at the dining room table with a cup of coffee that was still hot. The Hutch stood behind her against the wall, dark and present and patient. Through the window, the street below was ordinary. People passing in ordinary directions. The trees just beginning to show the first color of autumn. The world doing what it always does, continuing. She put the notice down and picked up her coffee and thought about what it meant. Thought about a piece of land she had never seen, in a country she had visited only once, that her great-great-grandmother's father had owned before a war had taken it from him, that had waited in documents hidden in leather for decades to be found by someone who would do something with them. She thought about going there, about standing on land that had carried her family's name before any of the women in her lineage were born, about what it would mean to walk the boundaries of a place that had been preserved in paper and darkness and the long patience of the hidden. She would go. Not yet, but she would go. She would take Mia, and she would show her the place that was connected to who they were in ways that no eviction notice or credit card balance or cold cup of tea could reach, connected below all of that, in the deep, quiet place where families store what they cannot afford to lose. Mia came through the kitchen in the particular trajectory of a child who is going somewhere with purpose. She was carrying a sketchbook and the tin of pencils she kept in her room, and she was headed for the dining room, for the spot on the floor by the window where the light came in, for the hutch that she had drawn 100 times now and kept returning to, not because she had not captured it yet, but because it was different each time, the light different, the grain different, her own eye different as she grew. She set herself up on the floor without speaking, opened the sketchbook to a clean page, and began. Her hand moved across the paper with the focused attention of someone who was really looking, who was not drawing what she thought the thing looked like, but what it actually was. The specific way the dark wood absorbed light in some places and threw it back in others. The particular curve of the brass handles, the long, straight line of the top edge, where Nora's hand and Elena's hand, and how many other hands before that had rested. Nora watched her from across the room and didn't say anything. She drank her coffee and let the morning be what it was. Through the window, the light was changing, the quality of autumn in it, something warmer and more slanted than the summer light, and it fell across the hutch in a way that made the wood glow slightly from within, as if the thing were lit from somewhere inside itself. Mia looked up from her drawing and looked at the hutch for a moment, not at her paper, but at the thing itself, with the direct, clear gaze she brought to things she was trying to understand fully. Then she looked at Nora. "It's different today," she said. Nora looked at the hutch, the autumn light on the dark wood, the brass handles, the creak on the left hinge that had been the same sound for as long as anyone alive could remember, and the hidden compartment behind the seamless panel, empty now of its objects, empty of the wrapped packages and the leather envelope and the cases and the cylinders, holding nothing now but the air and the darkness and the shape of what had been there. "Different how?" Nora said. Mia looked back at her drawing. "Like it knows something happened," she said. "Like it's lighter." Nora looked at the hutch for a long moment, the wood dark and warm in the morning light, the grain rising slightly under imagined touch, the particular presence of something old and enduring, something that had outlasted the people who dismissed it, that had carried what it was asked to carry without asking to be acknowledged, but that had waited with the patience of wood and brass and hidden mechanisms for the right hands, The right moment. The right question pressed in the right place. Like it's lighter. Yes, some things carry more than they show. And when they finally set it down, they stand a little taller for the having carried it. This was Elena's last gift. Not the stamps, not the coins, not the land in Spain, whose soil she had never touched. The gift was the knowledge that what everyone else had seen as nothing was everything, and that the woman who had recognized that was exactly the woman Elena had known she would be. Nora picked up her coffee, which was warm in her hands. She looked at her daughter on the floor, drawing with the quiet intensity of someone practicing how to see. She looked at the hutch against the wall, lighter now, emptied of its long secret, standing in the autumn light as it had always stood, somehow with the particular gravity of things that have been trusted and have not failed the trust. She did not cry. She had cried at the right times, and they had passed, and what remained on the other side of them was something she had not had before and could not lose now. A ground under her feet that was not borrowed, a future that was not a calculation against despair, but an actual space, open and real and hers. She thought about all the mornings she had sat at a table with numbers that never balanced, and the quiet that pressed down on small hours, and the weight of being the only person standing between her daughter and the edge of things. She had done that, had done it alone, and without drama, and without asking anyone to acknowledge it. Had kept going when the reasonable response was to stop. Had said, "I want it," when the room said, "Let it go." She set her coffee down. Outside, though the street was doing its ordinary work. Inside, Mia's pencil moved across paper. The hutch stood in the light. The left hinge waited for the door to open. Nora Vásquez was 38 years old, and she was no longer tired in the way that sleep could not fix. She was something else now. Something that had come through the other side of years of insufficient, and arrived somewhere that had its own air, its own weight, its own quality of light. She was home. The letter from Jordi Puig arrived on a Friday in March, 16 months after the first notice from Spain. It was not an email this time. It was paper, formal and weighted, sealed in an envelope with a government crest that Nora had not seen before. She stood at the mailbox in the lobby of her building and held it for a moment before opening it, the way she had once held the eviction notice, recognizing the shape of something important through the paper before she had read a single word. And she opened it on the stairs rather than waiting for the elevator. It was written in Spanish, dense with legal language, and she read it slowly, translating as she went, certain phrases requiring a second pass, a third. By the time she reached the last paragraph, her hands were not trembling, the way they had once trembled over documents she feared. They were still. The stillness of someone reading the answer to a question they have been carrying for a long time, and finding that the answer is yes. The Spanish government's Cultural Restitution Commission had reviewed the claim. The documentation, including the pre-war title deeds, the philatelic provenance records that established the family's presence and status in Catalonia before 1939, and the supporting testimony from the authentication process, had been found sufficient to proceed to formal restoration. The property, 47 hectares of agricultural and coastal land in the province of Girona, had legally reverted to the Vásquez family as the documented heirs of its last registered owner. There were conditions, assessments to be completed, a formal transfer process that would take additional months. But the word at the center of the document was unmistakable. Restoration. She sat on the third step of the stairwell in her building with the letter in her hands, and the word restoration sitting in her chest like something warm, and she thought about Soledad, who had left that land behind in 1939 and had carried the proof of it across an ocean in a coat lining and had never gone back. Had never been able to go back. Had lived the rest of her life knowing what she had left, and choosing to preserve the evidence of it, rather than let it dissolve into the general silence of things that war takes and does not return. She had wanted it to come back, not to herself, perhaps, because she was a practical woman who understood what was possible in her own lifetime. But to someone, to the right hands at the right time, and she had done the only thing available to her, which was to keep the proof alive and pass it forward and trust the chain. Nora folded the letter carefully. She put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her chest, and walked upstairs to call Priya. She went to Spain in June, when Mia's school year ended. They flew into Barcelona and took the train north along the coast, through towns that rose from the water in clusters of pale stone, through tunnels and across bridges where the sea appeared suddenly on one side and disappeared again, as if it were deciding whether to stay. Mia sat with her face close to the window and drew in the sketchbook she had brought, quick impressions of what passed: a tower, a harbor, the angle of a hillside against the sky. She had packed 6 sketchbooks for a 10-day trip, which Nora had not argued with. Geordie Pug met them at the station in Girona. He was a small man with the rapid energy of someone who processed the world faster than most people around him, and had learned to slow his speech to avoid alarming them. He shook hands with a precision that conveyed respect rather than formality, and spoke to Mia directly, asking her about the sketchbook in the careful English of someone who had practiced it and was proud of the practice. Mia showed him a drawing she had made on the train, and he studied it seriously and said the angle was very good. And Mia said thank you with the particular confidence of a child who has been raised to receive a genuine compliment without deflecting it. He drove them out of the city into the countryside, where the road narrowed between hedgerows, and the light became the particular quality of Mediterranean afternoon, horizontal and golden and old. The land opened on both sides, fields and orchards, and in the distance, the line of the coast, the water dark blue beyond the low hills. He said almost nothing during the drive. He understood that this was not a moment that required commentary. He turned onto a road that was barely a road, 2 worn tracks through grass, and stopped at a place where a low stone wall marked the edge of a field. Beyond the wall, the land ran down toward a stand of olive trees, and then opened into a wider space, rough grass and wildflowers, and at the far edge, where the land met a low cliff, the glint of the sea. "This is the boundary," he said. "From here to the cliff, and from the old irrigation channel to the north, is all the property." Nora got out of the car. The air smelled of thyme and warm stone and the salt that was coming in from the coast on a light wind. She stood at the stone wall and looked at the land that had belonged to a man she had never known, that had been taken from him, that had traveled as documentation through a coat lining and a ship and a border and a hidden compartment in a piece of furniture for 8 decades, and that was now being returned. Mia climbed over the stone wall without ceremony and began walking through the grass toward the olive trees, sketchbook in hand, already looking. Nora watched her daughter move through the field, small against the space of it, unhurried, her pencil moving across the page as she walked, capturing the way the olive trees bent slightly in the wind, the particular silver green of their leaves, the way the light came down between them and landed on the ground in pieces. She had not seen this place before, and she was already drawing it as if she belonged to it, as if belonging was something her hands could establish faster than the rest of her. Nora climbed over the wall. The grass was dry and springy under her feet. She walked slowly, not toward the olive trees where Mia had gone, but down the center of the field, following the long slope of the land as it moved toward the cliff. The thyme smell intensified as she walked, and she understood it was underfoot. And growing low in the grass, crushed slightly by each step, releasing its smell upward. She stopped halfway down the field and turned in a full circle, seeing the land in all directions, the stone wall at the top, the olive trees to her left, Mia's small figure moving among them, the cliff edge ahead, and beyond it, the sea. She thought about Soledad standing somewhere on this land before the war. A young woman, or perhaps not young. She did not know how old Soledad had been when she left. Standing somewhere on this same soil, with the same smell of thyme and the same sound of the wind, and looking out at the same sea. Knowing she was going, and not knowing if the leaving was permanent. Taking what could be carried, leaving what could not. Trusting the things she left behind to the patience of paper and darkness and the chain of hands that might, one day, bring them back. Nora crouched and pressed her palm flat against the ground. The earth was warm from the sun. She could feel the texture of it through her hand, dry and fine at the surface, firmer beneath. She stayed there for a moment, her hand on the ground of a place that had traveled from a coat lining to a hidden compartment, to an auction room, to a legal filing to this specific field on this specific afternoon, and let the chain rest. Then she stood up and walked toward the olive trees to find her daughter. They stayed for 10 days. They spent 3 of them at the property with Geordie, walking the boundaries and meeting the local official who oversaw the restoration process, a woman named Consul who spoke no English but communicated through a combination of Catalan and gesture and the occasional word of Spanish that Nora could follow. Consul had lived in the next village her entire life and had a memory for the land that went back decades, and she told them, through Geordie's translation, that the old families in the area still remembered the name, that her grandmother had spoken of the people who had owned this field, that it was a good piece of land, she said, and looked at Nora in a way that conveyed she was glad it was going back to the right hands. The remaining days they spent as travelers. They went to Barcelona and walked the old city, and Mia filled 2 sketchbooks and stood in front of the Sagrada Familia for 40 minutes without speaking, which was the longest Mia had ever been silent in the presence of something impressive, which told Nora everything she needed to know about what her daughter had seen in it. They ate things they had not eaten before. They sat at small tables in the evenings and watched the streets and talked about small things and large things with the relaxed attention of people who have enough time and know it. On the last evening, sitting at a table in the old quarter of Girona, with the stone walls of the city rising on 3 sides and the river moving quietly below the bridge, Mia put down her fork and looked at Nora with the direct gaze that meant she was going to say something she had been thinking about for a while. "Did great-grandmother Elena ever come here?" she asked. Nora thought about it. She did not know for certain. She did not think so. "I don't think she ever came back," she said. Mia considered this, but she kept everything so that we could. "Yes." Mia picked up her fork again. Then she said, "I'm going to come back, when I'm older, and I want to see it in different seasons." Nora looked at her daughter across the table, 9 years old, and already planning her returns to a place she had visited for the first time 3 days ago, already thinking in terms of seasons and time and the different qualities of light, already treating this piece of land as something that belonged to her future as much as it belonged to her past. "Yes," Nora said, "we'll come back." Mia nodded as if this were settled, which it was, and returned to her food with the focused appetite of a child who had walked a great deal that day and earned her dinner. Nora watched her and felt the particular quality of contentment that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of sufficiency. The sense that what you have is proportionate to what you need, that the ground under you is solid, and the future is genuinely open, rather than a series of narrowing options that you were trying not to look at too directly. The river moved below the bridge. The evening light settled into the stones of the old walls. Somewhere above them, a window opened, and the smell of something cooking drifted down to where they sat. The world was doing its ordinary work, and they were inside it without pressing against its edges for the first time in as long as Nora could remember. Simply present, simply there. Two women from a long line of women who had learned to carry what needed carrying, and to know, when the time came, how to set it down. On the plane home, Mia fell asleep against Nora's shoulder somewhere over the Atlantic. Her sketchbook had slipped from her hands and lay open on her lap to the last drawing she had made before she fell asleep. It was the view from the cliff edge on the Girona property, done in pencil, with the confident hand of someone who had been looking at it all week and had saved this particular angle for last. The olive trees in the foreground, the rough grass, on and beyond the cliff edge, the sea stretching out to where the horizon made its clean line between water and sky. Nora looked at the drawing for a long time in the dim cabin light. She thought about what it meant that her daughter had chosen this view. The view from the edge of the land, looking out toward everything that was still open, still possible, still to be crossed or explored or simply witnessed. Not looking back at the stone wall, not looking inward at the roots of the olive trees, but looking out. She thought about the hutch waiting at home in the dining room, empty of its secret now, standing in whatever light the season brought through the window. The left hinge still ready to creak at its particular note when the glass door opened. It had done what it was built to do. It had waited, and it had held, and it had yielded to the right hands at the right moment. And now it stood in an ordinary dining room in an ordinary city, being an ordinary piece of furniture again, which was not a diminishment, but a completion. It had earned its ordinariness. It had paid for it with decades of patience. She thought about her grandmother's hands on the top edge, the habitual gesture of a lifetime, the weight of what those hands had known and kept and trusted forward. She thought about the women in the chain, Soledad and Elena, and now herself, and now Mia, already drawing the land with the eye of someone who would know how to see it in all its seasons. The chain did not end. It continued in the direction of the horizon, toward whatever was still open. She leaned her head back against the seat and let the hum of the engine settle into her, and closed her eyes and did not sleep, but rested in the particular way that is available only to people who have stopped waiting for something and arrived instead at the place they were waiting to reach. Not an ending, a different beginning, one that did not start from nothing, but from everything that had been carried forward and set down and passed on by hands that had trusted the chain. Some things carry more than they show, and when they finally set it down, the world is lighter for it. And so are you. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.